Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm here to welcome you to the HEPI Advanced HE Joint Seminar on Equalities Plus. How can higher education leaders create inclusive institutions? I'm Alexis Brown, Director of Policy and Advocacy at HEPI. Normally we do these in the House of Commons, but it's great to have you here all online. We are, however, going to have our third one of these in person in the House of Commons on May 24th. That's going to be on measuring the wrong things. How should we judge the success of universities in creating value? Very topical with all of the consultations out now, so do look out for that. Today's panel will be discussing how universities can create inclusive institutions. This has been an important issue for a long time now, but I think the past few years and the pandemic in particular has brought into sharp relief how crucial it is for universities to be on the front foot in supporting their students across a wide range of equality issues. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand across to David Bass, who will be chairing this session and fielding questions afterwards. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Alexis, and welcome everyone. I'm David Bass. I'm Advanced HE's Associate Director for EDI. I'm really pleased to be here. These HEPI Advanced HE sessions are a great opportunity to step back and consider some of the really big, challenging questions facing the sector. And we certainly have a few of those around equality and diversity, particularly as Alexis mentioned, as EDI has really become more of a strategic priority for institutions. We've seen more topics requiring a whole institution approach. We've seen EDI come into overlap and tension and conflict with other strategic priorities. So there are a broad set of topics that I think we can get into today. And we have a really good set of speakers, so I'd like to introduce briefly. Our first speaker is Professor Kshitij Kapoor, who's the President and Principal of King's College London. He's returned to lead King's in June 2021, following more than 4 years at the University of Melbourne, where he was Dean and Assistant Vice Chancellor for the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Social Sciences, and interim DVC International. Professor Kapoor previously served at King's as Assistant Principal for Academic Performance, and before that was Dean and Head of School for the Institute of Psychiatry and the founding Executive Dean of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. Our second speaker is Kashika Patel. Kashika is Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for EDI at De Montfort University. Her research interests include criminal justice with a specific focus on young offenders and their experiences within the criminal justice system. But particularly focusing on the experiences of young females and Black young people. Kashika also has an interest in the transition of Black young people into HE, especially for those who might be first-generation students and in their experience of university life and academia. And then last but not least, we're joined by Professor David Roubain. So David is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Culture, Equality and Inclusion at the University of Sussex, and he joined in autumn 2021. He has strategic responsibility for all aspects of their work on culture, equality, and inclusion, including progressing work on race equity, LGBTQ+ advancement, and dignity and respect. David has previously been advising the Premier League on equality issues. He's been a consultant at Equality Works, and he's been the Chief Executive of Advanced HE's own Equality Challenge Unit. He's a visiting professor of law at Birkbeck College and also a consultant with Black Thrive Global, who seek to address the impact of systemic racism on Black communities. David is the past winner of Radar's People of the Year for achievement in the furtherance of human rights of disabled people in the UK, and he's been one of the 25 most influential disabled people in the UK by Disability Now magazine. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Please do use the chat and also submit questions separately through the Q&A function. You can upvote questions that you like, and then as chair, I'll be selecting from these questions and directing them to our panelists. We do potentially have some journalists in the room, which is worth being mindful of. I'd encourage us to have a really open conversation. We need to be able to talk honestly about these challenges, be clear about where we are figuring things out as a sector, and we don't have clear answers. We need to be able to make mistakes in talking about some of these things, and I think that's the right approach as we begin today's session. So without any further ado, I will very quickly hand over to Kshitij. Kshitij, can I please welcome you to our session today? You're on mute, Kshitij.
David, greetings. Can I just check that you can hear me now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much for this invitation. And that was a rather overly long introduction of my credentials. So thank you for that. But I think listeners would have noted that I do not really bring any deep scholarship or professional qualifications or a sort of consultancy expertise in the area of EDI. So thank you for bringing me on a panel with Kaushika and David, who clearly do. But perhaps what I do bring is diversity of international experience. So I've had the privilege of now working in universities in the US, in Canada, Australia, and the UK. And I've seen the efforts at EDI from all of those different universities. And I think the first point I would make is that all of these, admittedly Western universities and Western liberal democracies, are struggling with this issue. We're working out how to get this right. But in that context, I have to say that I think British universities collectively are right up there. We're at the forefront of understanding these issues, of coming up with solutions, often making mistakes. So I think we should start with that platform, that even though there is a long way to go, and where we are today is certainly not good enough, I think we do have to acknowledge the progress that we're making, and that we are in the leading peloton of people who are trying to address this. Now, with that, perhaps I could add 4 quick points in opening, and then happy to take questions and discussion. The first point that I have learned really as a vice chancellor of a university is the critical importance of where you position EDI in your organization. The second thing I'd want to talk about is EDI beyond numbers. Because, when all of these league tables and everything gets going, everything gets reduced to a number. But I would say that there are certainly some elements of EDI that defy easy numerology. And if you chase numbers, you might get them wrong. The third point I'd like to emphasize that EDI in university has to go beyond the traditional protected characteristics, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And I'll finally end with a bit of a note on what I might call preventative EDI work. I'm a physician, I think, in terms of preventative medicine, so I might speak of that. So first, about the critical importance of positioning EDI in your organization. Now, look, I have to say we've been very fortunate at King's, and I'm new to King's, so I can't take much credit for it. That we had a terrific leader in Sarah Guerra, who led a small but highly effective EDI team, and really moved it to have very powerful and comprehensive impact across King's. And over the last, I would say, 5 years, King's has managed to get an Athena Silver Award, a Workplace Equality Index ranking, of where we're amongst top of our universities. And if we measure simple numbers like number of female professors or gender gap, we do reasonably well as compared to the research universities. But I'm a little bit mindful that in our university, as in many others, because of these successes, there is often a sense that this work is sort of given to the EDI unit to do, that it's their responsibility. Partly because often when it comes to making these external applications, they have to take a lead in bringing everything together and doing it. And at least one of the things I realized that these things, if they are just left to a unit, do not have the institution-wide impact that one achieves. So one of the early things that became very evident to me as I moved to King's is that I felt that this had to be, it had to have prominence right at the top. And at the very top of our organization is, of course, the council of the university. And I realized that even though our council had a finance committee, it has an estates committee, it has an audit and risk committee, it didn't really have a committee dedicated to people and culture in its wider sense. And that's currently at the moment true of many university councils. My other experiences in the health sector, and I dare say that the health sector boards that I've served on are increasingly coming to realize the very critical importance of people more broadly, culture, and of course embedded within it, the EDI practice, and are increasingly giving it board level prominence. So the first lesson for me, and we've just implemented it, is not only to have a very strong EDI unit, usually linked to your HR unit, but really to give it prominence at the council level that we now have. Now, I can't say that in a month or two, the world has changed, but I'm hoping that over the next many years, this will have an impact on how we think as an organization. And of course, along with that is presence on the senior team, which we now have. But I want to speak, so positioning is important, but the next thing I would suggest is EDI beyond numbers. Because of course the E in the EDI is more about equality of opportunities, perhaps in some ways removing barriers and allowing equal access. The D in that is of course diversity. It's recognizing, acknowledging, but ideally valuing and celebrating differences. But I think the hardest part is the I, it's the inclusivity, because that's harder to measure and at a deeper level is about culture change. So in my view, it's not enough to have diverse teams. I think it is making use of that diversity, and that cannot happen passively. So it can't be just because you have a sort of gender diverse and a ethnically diverse leadership team that you truly make inclusive decisions. I think that's something one has to be actively alert to in ensuring that you're always getting the roundedness of input, and every now and then having events or occasions or decisions in which the values trump the traditional rational decision making. Because in some sense, what we call rational decision making is also value laden in some ways. It's privileging some ways of thinking over other ways of thinking when we say it's rational, even if it is just privileging numbers over values. So I think EDI, as it makes its journey, will have to go beyond numbers. It'll have to go beyond league tables. It'll have to infuse, in some sense, our values, and won't be a passive enterprise, but will be an active enterprise of inclusion. But the point I want to make in universities, that in universities, EDI has to go beyond the protected characteristics, so to say. And by that, I mean that there are some special, if I may say, divisions or hierarchies within universities that we need to be very alert to. The very simplest one is, I would say, in most universities, there is a difference in the place that the academic part of the enterprise sees itself in and the professional services see themselves in. And in some sense, getting a complete inclusion on those grounds in the mission of the university is a very important point. But I think good universities are indeed making that progress. But I want to actually focus within academia. I think within the academic aspects of the university, you actually find that increasingly now there are divisions. There are divisions between those who have a teaching and research joint function, and then those collectively who have a more education-focused function. And increasingly, as universities are going into this third stream of having impact on knowledge exchange, there is a big question for us as to how do we get parity of esteem for all the different things that a university does. And because our traditional means of recognition, our traditional rituals and symbols really do celebrate research achievement often over educational achievements, and both of those over perhaps some other elements of knowledge exchange and impact activity. Now, I can say the system I look to where they're systematically addressing this is the Dutch higher education system. They have really come together as a system. So the Dutch universities, their ministry that funds education, the ministry that funds research, have really come together in a program that's called Room for Everyone's Talent. if you just go and Google room for everyone's talent, Dutch universities, you'll actually get a good link to that work. So I think that's an aspect of inclusion which you don't see relevant to all the industries, but increasingly becoming very relevant to universities as our workforce becomes more heterogeneous and diverse. And the last one, to end with an example, is what I would call preventative EDI. And of course, my attention has been drawn to it, particularly in the context of the pandemic, as we've seen that the pandemic has differentially affected people's mental health and well-being. Now, one response to this would be just to be attentive to the outcomes of this. But I think the thing that I, as a psychiatrist and a mental health specialist, I said I'm not really an EDI specialist, but I am a specialist or something. And for 3 decades, I've thought a lot about mental health and well-being, and particularly in our youth. I think something that was very important for me is that in that overall rubric of being attentive to differences and inclusion, we not see mental health only through the lens of deficits and remedy, but in some sense, we make it a part of what universities do every day. And what we do every day, of course, is educate our students. So colleagues at King's are working with the universities of Derby and Aston and Advance HE and Student Minds. We've tried to come up with a toolkit. It's called Education for Mental Health Toolkit. It's not education about mental health, by the way. It is how you can modify education in a way that it is inclusive of all people and positively promoting of mental health. So anyway, I won't spruik it anymore, but to leave it here as an example that there is a preventative element in many ways to equality, diversity, and inclusion when we come to practices within the university. So David, I hope I've said something that people will find interesting, and I'll thank you for giving me this time.
Thank you, Kshitij. And I do think the Room for Everyone's Talent initiative in Dutch HE is quite interesting, particularly the emphasis on more diversity in career paths. And I think that is something that we could learn from. I would like to invite Kaushika to join us now, please.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kshitij, for your opening remarks. So I'm going to follow a slightly similar format, and I have 5 points that I want to cover, and I'm going to look at it very particularly on the perspective of whole institution approach is powerful, but how does strategic and organizational leadership and governance need to evolve to encompass all of the related issues? So EDI is a plethora of topics, challenges, debates, and issues that are not, we don't live in a vacuum in HE. There are so many different elements that impact on us. And so for me, I'm looking at it from I suppose, strategically operational, if that's a term, perspective on how we actually consider moving forward as a sector. So I've got 5 points that I'm going to cover, and I'm particularly looking at the how for leaders. So my first point is about the language, about the terminology of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And do we actually understand what it means? What does it mean? What's the language take us to? We say words very often and they just become words. And do we take a moment to step back and have a consideration of what they actually mean? And these are, EDI are very worn words, in not just in HE, but in business and in industry as well. But if we really think about what the language means, and we have a look at what we're actually debating and working towards, I found a quite interesting piece a while back in Wonky from October of 21 by Pathik Pathak, where he talked about the language. And I'm just going to use some of the materials that he was talking about, which I found fascinating. And it's a debate we have in our university. So when we look at equality, equality is about treating everyone equally, or offering or aiming for equal outcomes. But it doesn't actually always necessarily lead to fair outcomes, because some people have some situations need different or more resources or emphasis or time. And so what we actually need is equity rather than equality. We need equitable access or equitable environments, which enable a sense of belonging, and allow our sector communities to be their true selves without having to constantly code switch. And I think that's something really important for senior leaders to consider. Are you looking for equity, or are you working on equality? And then if we look at inclusion and we move to looking to that word, the emphasis is placed there regarding inclusive spaces, inclusive places, but it doesn't necessarily speak of the quality or equity of participation. You can include somebody in all sorts of things, but are you actually offering an equitable quality in their participation? And so there might be a possibility that inclusion itself could imply a form of gatekeeping. Someone who lets others into that environment without the associated or necessary equity of participation. So I think it's really important that we think about, not necessarily just think about or debate, but really understand what it is that we're looking to achieve. And when you talk about and you look about equity, inclusion, diversity, for me, I think we need to self-reflect. So my second point is about self-reflection. Begin at the beginning. When I say self-reflection, I'm talking partly as individual senior leaders, partly as a whole institution, and partly as a sector. So we know that EDI positions, as in roles, statements and strategies, are prolific in our sector and many, many others, where institutional organisations are developing their strategies, but looking at differences that are explicit or specific to their particular university, and looking at particular relevance or important to what they might want to focus on. And we talk like we are now about EDI quite a lot. We write strategies to address, to challenge or eradicate discrimination, bias and disadvantage, which absolutely is all fair and good. But does reflection truly begin at the place where these types of decisions are made and enabled? So Kshitij talked a little bit about diversity on senior leadership teams or on boards. So I'd say that positions of power and authority can influence, impact and generate change. And who sits in those seats and their perspectives, their identities, their biases, their influences impact upon the decisions, how they're made and what are made. And sector-wide organisations and boards that promote and campaign for EDI truly and honestly do not necessarily reflect at moments in time, or sometimes over periods of time, the virtues of excellence of EDI that they are trying to promote. So diversity of voices in places of authority and decision-making will inevitably enable more holistic, sustainable progression in change. So that, for me, then leads on to my third point, which is about walking a day in another's shoes. And I went to a seminar a very long time where somebody enabled us to walk in their shoes. It was a student, a Black student, and we were all required to close our eyes and listen to her story. And some of you may have also heard many talks on TED Talks about a single story and what we understand. And I would say for senior leaders, if we're looking at a holistic approach, whatever protected characteristic, whatever area of inclusion, diversity, equity, equality we're looking at, listening to, but truly hearing the narratives, the lived experiences of our diverse communities, whose experience the industry of EDI is meant to enhance, has got to be core. The best and most sustainable and most supported change in EDI is found where those actions for change are rooted in understanding the lived experiences of our communities. So not only should our senior leaderships and our sector be reflecting on their starting points and the people and the places that decisions are made about how change might move forward, but also rooting and centering those change decisions in the people who are experiencing the disadvantage and discrimination. Now, this might all sound bread and butter to everybody, but clearly, as a sector, we're still having these conversations. So something somewhere along the line maybe needs a little bit of reconsideration and fixing. So for me, then that moves on to my fourth point, and it's a little bit of what Kshitij also talked about, was data and numbers. So for me, it's beyond the data. When you're working in this arena, we can have lots of debates, we can write lots of articles, and we can do lots of research, but practical, tangible outputs beyond that constant data debate and hand-wringing has got to be important. But within that, it's the concerted evaluation, the dissemination of good practice and what works, and collaboration as a sector during the fact and not after the fact. And what I mean by that is I'll use Black Lives Matter as an example, where many institutions were kick-started or fast-tracked, things that they were already thinking around race equity. And many of us worked individually rather than looking out as a sector. And slowly we started to listen to what each other were doing. But as a sector, we should be able to better mobilize, to understand what's working better where, and share that and translate that. And I'm not totally convinced that we do that. So I'm going to take us right back to the beginning, and my final point before I finish. Right back to the beginning, to what I started with, the how for leaders around the whole institution or even a whole sector approach, which is, I think a whole institution approach is absolutely key, and a whole sector approach would be beneficial. And the question is, if you're going to have a whole sector approach or a whole institution approach, what about all those different elements? How do they intersect and interact and interact, and which one takes priority, and should something take priority? So for me, it comes back to, what do we understand and what do we mean by EDI? And what are we actually looking to achieve within the variety of challenges and issues and tensions that fall within EDI in our considerations? We have silos of activity currently around our demographics, around our institutions. So Athena Swan, race equality, mental health action plans and toolkits. We need to think about an integrated intersectional pattern of working, which when considered might enable us to be much more holistic. And so we have to consider what is the key, what is the thread that runs through all of that. And I would suggest we need to look as a sector what the repeating issues are in all of our EDI challenges that we experience, and consider the how to bring these repeating issues to develop an interconnected system-wide approach. And for me, that leads back to one of my earlier points as a point of consideration of equity in belonging. The aim certainly needs to be to enable our communities to be their authentic selves without fear of bias, hate, or exclusion. And within all of that, before I sign off, we need to recognise that there will be disruption in this work. There always is, there always will be, to try and veer us off track. But also the other part of it is to remember the support needed for those who work on the front line of enabling change in EDI. It's a challenging environment to work in, where there is always pushback and there's always disruption. So it needs to be supported, well supported and well constructed within our sector. So that's enough from me for now. So I'll hand over back to David.
Thank you, Kaushika. And I think that idea that there is this growing range of areas that we think require a whole institution approach. We've talked about gender, talked about race equality, mental health, freedom of speech. How do we start to consider them together? And your challenge around integration, intersectionality, considering those common strands, equity and belonging, I think is a very useful provocation. And I'm interested in kind of delegates' views and responses to that, and maybe some further questions for our panel. Before we get to that, I would like to bring David Roubaix to the floor, please. David.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you, Kaushika and Kshitij, for those comments, which I'll try and complement with some reflections of my own. So the exam question is, so to speak, how can higher education leaders create inclusive institutions? And if I may, I'll offer some reflections over a recent historical period, because at least to my mind, that helps understand what the issues are and what potential solutions and responses might be. I suppose I should say, David, thank you for that very generous introduction. One thing that I might add to it is that for most of my career, I've been an education and equality lawyer. And I've worked in higher education for the last 12 years, but I come at this work conceptually from that perspective, as well as from a hopefully policy-rich understanding. And if we think about equality in the broader sense of the word, from a legislative point of view, and therefore from a societal point of view, because in many respects, there's an interesting symbiosis between public policy and law. First equality law was in 1965, which was a very, very thin piece of anti-racism legislation, which didn't go very far at all. But that was the time when there was a critical mass of thought of the need to address in some way ongoing oppression. And certainly arguably that arose because of post-war, in the UK at least, post-war migration, the Windrush community and the awful experiences that many of them faced. It doesn't mean to say that racism was invented after the Second World War, but culturally and politically and sociologically, matters evolved to enable people to put attention to it in albeit in a limited way. Since then, there has been an ever-growing level of complexity and arguably problematizing of issues relating to equality, diversity, and inclusion. We see this in the higher education sector with the growth in the number of leaders like myself, who are, and Kaushika and Kshitij, who are expressly charged with thinking about and addressing these issues. Probably 15 or 20 years ago, most EDI work was largely operational. Of course, there will be some strategic considerations, but largely operational. And now there's a general and increasing recognition of the strategic necessity and ambition of it. And I think that speaks to the growing nature of understanding of how identities play out in society and including in the higher education sector. In one sense, you could argue that we're moving as a society away from homogeneity, or if you're a cultural Marxist, as Gramsci would have put it, hegemony, to one where complexity, diversity are essential characteristics of any organizational design and any organizational ambition. And at this point, I probably will I will think for a moment about what's meant by E and D and I. Kaushika mentioned an analysis and referenced equity. I don't disagree. I take a slightly different approach to the nomenclature. For me, equality is probably the oldest concept we've had in this space and relates to fairness. So fairness in a race, if two people are applying for a job, none of them should be disadvantaged because of an irrelevant consideration like their race or their sex and so on. Equality is therefore quite limited. Most equality law is about opportunities, although some is about outcomes. In fact, more and more is about outcomes, but still historically it was all about opportunity. Diversity is a different concept, which is a recognition of the value of difference, of heterogeneity. And inclusion, I would argue, is a proposition that we need to affect our organizations and cultures in a particular way, which fully allows diverse people to participate. Now, different people will take different views as to what each of those mean, and I accept that. But to my mind, the three together afford an opportunity for effective change and progress. So that was a bit of a sideways look at something, but I want to come back to the higher education sector now, because alongside growing legislative change, so I mentioned in 1965 we had the Race Relations Act. Now we have legislation which reflects 9 protected characteristics, the beginnings of an attempt to consider intersectionality, so the combination of identities and the way that impacts on life experiences. But also from a university regulatory framework, there is more explicit framing of EDI ambitions, whether it be through ever evolving access and participation plans and widening participation initiatives for students, to conceptual requirements like decolonization and pedagogic changes, to all areas, well-being, mental health, all of which intersect with themselves protected characteristics. There's a growing number of priorities which directly inform and are informed by EDI matters. And that in turn requires complexity and strategic ambition. Of course, there are other initiatives which requirements rather, which directly overlap with EDI considerations. Freedom of speech and academic freedom is an obvious one. We've seen a lot of issues relating to that in recent years, and many of you will be familiar with those. But not only those, I'm very interested in the way that the well-being agenda, which has evolved, particularly with some injunctions from government and elsewhere to pay attention to that, itself overlaps with EDI considerations. So there is complexity, there's growing complexity requiring strategic ambition. What I think about that in terms of an effective university-wide response to those challenges and changes and complexity is that it requires confident and authentic leadership. I believe organizational design colleagues tell me that the authenticity may have had its day as a goal for leaders. I'm a big fan of authenticity. I think certainly in spaces like this, which is wrought with feeling, it's difficult to be effective unless one is authentic, by which I mean one brings one's whole self to the agenda. Authenticity can make a difference, particularly in cultural change, which a lot of this is about. I mean, by the way, obviously, it's important to have processes and procedures and policies which address some of the particularities of inequality and unfairness. And many, if not all, universities do that. But beyond that, the complexities that I described require leadership, in my view, and an ability to talk about, discuss, and confidently engage with these issues with the whole of an academic community. Specific initiatives that I think are becoming more prominent are allyship programs. By the way, all of these things are themselves contested. So I think it's an interesting feature of EDI life at the moment that even every word can be examined and critiqued. And so we need to be willing to listen and reflect and explain. But I think allyship programs, listening programs, even interesting analyses of what we're looking for, whether it's equality, diversity, or inclusion, or to pick from a different jurisprudential and legal framework, which human rights approaches, concepts of dignity, of human dignity, which are which lend themselves to different approaches, I think, in organizational design and culture. Fundamentally, I think that the challenges that are brought, whether it be some of the contentious issues that we've seen recently, or things that are dormant but are likely to come up, are ones which are solvable if leaders are able to feel that they can engage fully with the subjects, with their communities in those issues. By the way, I don't pretend that they will be easy, and I don't pretend that we'll come unstuck in many moments. But I think it is certainly possible, not least because some of the issues which are hot now were not hot before and won't be hot in the future. And I'm sure many of us can think of issues from 10, 20, 30 years ago, which were very difficult to resolve, but for which now there is at least more of a consensus as to a way forward. I think the final thing I'll say is identity itself is becoming more nuanced and more complex. and hence the growth in thinking around intersectionality. All identities pretty much, I mean, this is also a contested issue, but by and large, perhaps subject to one or two nuances, all or most identities are constructs. And as we think and understand what they mean, we get more and more nuance and detail. We have to engage with that. I think it can be a problem, it can lead to conflict, but we have to engage with it. And in the engagement, there are solutions, ultimately ones which avoid a zero-sum game, avoid one group or one perspective having to be defeated. Now, perspective is perhaps not the right word. One set of legitimate interests having to be defeated. We can avoid that, but it is complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We've covered a lot of ground, both in your specific contribution, but also in the three together. And I think that means we've got a fair few kind of questions to begin to get into, which is great. What we'll do with the Q&A portion is I will invite delegates to ask their questions. We should be able to at least turn on audio. And we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and I will direct those to our panel in various ways. So if we could invite Julie to ask her question first, followed by Emily, and then Shraddha, please.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I am just moving room. While I get called to discuss, we have value for money, but how are we going to influence policymakers to consider value for society, recognising the importance of breaking through barriers through things such as first in family, which they may not have immediate impact, but they do drive generational change?
Sorry, Julia, I think we missed the first part of the question. Do you mind?
Okay. No, of course, I'll repeat it. So you talked about beyond the numbers, but we're increasingly regulated by numbers. We have the value for money agenda, but how do we influence policymakers to consider value for society, recognising the importance of breaking through barriers through things such as widening participation and first in family, which may not have immediate impact, but do drive generational change?
Thank you, Julie.
I hope that made sense.
And then can we come to Emily next, please?
Hello, yes, and my comment follows on very neatly from that one. It's again about the policy agenda, the regulatory framework, how universities are measured and assessed, but also a particular point I wanted to make about league table rankings and entry tariff. My organisation's come on leaps and bounds in our APP plan. I'm not saying APP is the entirety of ED&I, but we've done really well, but we're a top 10 uni in the league table. We wouldn't want to drop down in that sense. So it's just about competing priorities and competing policy agendas.
Thank you, Emily. And Shraddha, please. You're on mute, Shraddha, if you're talking.
Yeah, hi, David. Thank you. I mean, my question was more around evaluation and talking a bit about how panelists have had an opportunity to kind of evaluate for impact and have almost what do we stop doing? What do we start doing? Because there's a real looming risk of initiative fatigue that I found in my kind of EDI work, and just interested in reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't hear all of that, but I think I could see some people writing things down, and I can see something about evaluation and impact. So can we go first to Kshitij? And I wonder, Kshitij, if we can comment on some of those conversations about how we work with policymakers, how we begin to look at impact and value beyond some of the metrics that we're being asked for. And I'm also interested in your views as a Vice Chancellor on impact and what you look for from EDI initiatives at an institutional level. And then coming to David and Kashika, I guess, to get a more specific EDI focused look in your role supporting institutions in these spaces, particularly picking up those comments about how EDI intersects with some of the specific requirements for OFS, but also roundtables. So Kshitij, we'll start with you and then go to Kashika and then David again. You're on mute, Kshitij.
Thank you for that opportunity, David, and thank you for those questions. And I must say, opening statements are easier to make. Your questions get very quickly to the complexity of the matter. But let me give you one example and then perhaps try and address your question. And you see, unless you measure in some way, you really don't know what you're dealing with. However, the problem is once you start measuring, it's very easy to become captive to numbers because in some sense, the numbers become the outcomes. And let me give you a very interesting dilemma that we had. And it's in the public domain. And what I'm going to see won't surprise you after I've said it, is King's, like all the other universities, has a large number of employees. And at one stage, it used to outsource a lot of its cleaning and security functions. And King's monitors its gender pay gap, as well as it monitors its ethnic pay gap. And even though the latter is harder to measure, we're sensitive to it. So now along comes a proposition to perhaps consider insourcing cleaning and security work. Now, in our particular instance, the profile of the colleagues who were doing that kind of work, were we to insource them, was of course not ethnically neutral. It was, very significantly Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And I dare say that since this is sort of the cleaning and security kind of work, which is at one end of the pay spectrum, if you insource that work, actually all your ethnic pay gap numbers, even though we were paying above what was the market rent, market price at that point in time, nonetheless, it is for that strata of work. In some sense, your ethnicity pay gap significantly increases. And now if as an organization, and look, I can talk about this because I wasn't who made this right decision, but nonetheless, it just gives you a sense of the kind of dilemmas you focus. So do you do what seems like the right thing, which was insourcing this regular work, making it a part of the King's payroll? But the price you pay for doing that is on the surface. Your ethnicity pay gap now significantly increases. And there was considerable debate about this in the organization. I think my predecessors finally did the right thing. We insourced close to about 450 colleagues and significantly fell in the appearance of our ethnicity pay gap, even though we didn't really change ethnic pay one way or the other. So that is the challenge. Until you measure these things, you don't know. And if you measure them, you're often, not always, hostage to these interesting dilemmas. But the point I would say about these measurements, and this follows for something that David sort of hinted at, as we start recognizing more characteristics, these measurements and their permutations, particularly now that you start looking at intersectionality, you can just see how quickly your table proliferates. So, if you're looking at 8 protected characteristics as well as intersection of that with 2 or 3 other dimensions, you're very quickly looking at a very complex table. And you could almost lose yourself in that table. So I don't have an easy answer. The numbers are necessary. They do lead to paradoxes. But I would like to end with what I think David and Kaushika were both hinting at, that probably what matters to us in the end most in EDI is that sense of inclusivity and belonging. And that is a part of your culture. That cannot be measured that easily. People will say that you can do employee surveys and ask them, do you feel you belong to the organization? But I'm not so sure whether it gets to the heart of the matter. So I don't think I've answered the question you asked, because frankly, I don't find a simple answer to it, but I hope I've given you some different perspectives on the challenge in your question.
Thank you, Kshitij. Kaushika, can I come to you?
Yes, the joy and the challenge of EDI is its complexity and answering challenging questions which won't always satisfy everybody. So I'll give it a go. So there's a number of things within that, and I'm just going to try and touch on each of them really briefly. So there's the value for money, value for society, but not focusing just on the data is one of the things that I'd said. And then the policy and the reg framework and evaluation. So, you know, I'd said let's go beyond the data, but as Kshitij said, you absolutely need the data to give you a baseline of understanding. So when we started looking at the awarding gap in our institution, when we were working with Kingston University, the way I actually opened the door to get academics, and it was academics, to actually pay attention to this was providing them with the data and the shocking data of the gap. So the data has a place and a position in enabling us to opening the doors to have the conversations about equity, about inclusion, representation. So data is relevant. However, we need to then move, once we've got that, and we can see the baselines, we often find ourselves going round in circles and continuously talking about data. Now, our frameworks require us to do that. We're looking at the NSS and what the data shows us. We're looking at APP and what the data shows us. And we're constantly working on that. So we have to use that, I would say as an EDI practitioner, we have to use that as a tool to look at what the challenges and the triggers are, and then look at what we actually want our institution to represent. What do we see as the biggest gaps and challenges, and work towards those. Framework wise and value for money, EDI is like a tanker, you know, to move it, to turn it around and from the direction that it's in at the minute, it's going to take a long time. So the evaluation element of the work isn't going to get an evaluation after 12 months. It is important to evaluate in different forms, and I understand initiative fatigue, but I think that's part of the problem. We don't give enough time for some of the things that we're doing to demonstrate effective change. We jump 1 year, we have up and down figures, and we worry and we jump to another initiative and another initiative. We need to give our initiatives time to be able to then demonstrate impact, and then also demonstrate value for money within our regulatory frameworks. And the problem though is impatience in our regulators, impatience in government, and impatience in ourselves and our, I was going to say service users, but that's my social work background coming in there in terms of our staff and students. So I don't know if I've answered the question. I do think they're all connected, and that we need to be patient and give time, although I'm one of those people that gets impatient when I don't see change. So it's easier said than done. I do appreciate that. And if David maybe has an alternative or better response to that.
Thank you, Kaushika. And David, we'll turn to you if you have any other thoughts you want to add to Kaushika or Kshitij's. I'd also like, David, to pose to you kind of what was part of this question, and I think Kshitij nodded towards this as well, is that when we're looking across some of these different areas and considering data and values-led approaches, as we start to adopt intersectionality as an approach within our institutions, it has the potential to, as Kshitij said, kind of drive more complexity, but it also has the potential to allow us to identify commonalities and bring things together. And I wonder if you might comment on that from an institutional perspective.
Thanks, David. I'll try. I'm not just so I'll restrict my comments to those which might supplement those made by Kshitij and Kaushika. I don't know that I've got much to add around valuing widening participation in EDI as against value for money, other than to say the obvious, which is whilst value for money is an imperative for universities and indeed all organizations, there are other imperatives. So it isn't the case, in my view at least, value for money doesn't trump everything else. And it's trite, but of course you need to try and do things efficiently and effectively, but value for money isn't the only driver. When I was at the Equality Challenge Unit, and David, this may still be the case at Advance, I used to be asked a lot, who's the best at EDI? Which is, who does it well? Who does it well is a very reasonable question. Who is the best is an impossible question to answer. And of course, there is no one institution that is the champion of EDI. There are many, many good initiatives in different institutions. And in those conversations, I would sometimes refer to examples of good practice in some institutions. The reason I say that is I'm thinking about the league table issue. I suspect what's behind it is the huge driver, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years in the sector, to prioritize ranking over other things because of what that might mean for reputation and then student numbers and potentially attraction of research income and so on. And again, this is one of the many competing priorities. But what I would say, at the risk of sounding trite, is that EDI will complement those things. I mean, literally complement them through better NSS scores, which then are reflected in rankings. But anyway, otherwise complement them in terms of, I remember qualitative research we did about what drove academics to choose one university over another where they had a choice. And it was more ephemeral or less quantifiable issues like culture and well-being and EDI. So there is a complementarity between EDI and rankings, in my view. And finally, on evaluation, it is difficult. I actually do think quantitative as well as qualitative data does matter and does help. At least it gives you benchmarks. But to your point, finally to your point, David, the ever more complex way of thinking about individuals, so that we no longer just have 9 protected characteristics plus socioeconomic disadvantage, but arguably, innumerable combinations of 2 or more of those 10 identities. I think it means that we have to change, in the longer term, we have to change our way of thinking to a much more, away from, a single way of doing things and a more fluid understanding of the relationship that our communities bring to the table. And I recognize that can sound Pollyanna-ish, but it is the challenge for leaders, I think.
Thank you, David. We're starting to get some really good questions here. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 more and I will direct these to individual panelists and then invite other comments if you would like to comment on the other questions as well. So can we please we'll go Parveen and then Zachary and then Sally Jackson. So Parveen, if you could join us, please.
Thanks, David. So my question is, how do you prevent the burden of EDI work falling to those with the protected characteristics? I'm thinking about the people who give up their time to drive action plans, to run events, and it's always the same people, and it's the people who should be benefiting the most but end up putting most of the work in.
Thank you, Parveen. And Kaushika, when we come to it, I'll ask you to respond to that because you've made, I think, quite relevant comments about the importance of representation in decision-making and action. And I think that creates a tension, and I'm interested in your views on that. Can we invite Zachary, please, to ask his question?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the time today. I'm interested in the very practical, tangible things that you've seen. And I know that's quite a widespread question, but I think oftentimes we have a lot of discussions, but I'm really interested in just one or two things that you've seen that have had success. I understand those are contextual questions, but very practical, tangible things that have been instituted or implemented that you've found successful in this space.
Thank you, Zachary. And Kshitij, I think given your background, your experience across continents, as well as your position within an institution and our focus today on kind of understanding EDI in that strategic institutional space, I'm interested in your views on what you've seen as particularly impactful initiatives.
Sure.
And then finally, a question for David from Sally Jackson.
Thank you very much indeed. So yeah, so my question is, how do we manage this seemingly thorny issue of inclusion, which I absolutely get and I very much support, but the notion which David mentioned too about academic freedom and freedom of speech, and tolerance, where we can sometimes get opposing factions and deeply held, no doubt entirely genuine beliefs, but there is a lack of tolerance on seeing the other side too. And to add to the complexity, that fine line of when we're within the law and bordering on being outside the law.
Thank you, Sally. That's a great question. Kaushika, can we come to you to start, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Parvin. Great question. It's all the work that I do and all the people that I work with and talk to, you being one of them, we often talk about the people that put themselves forward because they're the ones that are impacted and get to a point of frustration, of lack of change. And often those people are not in positions, those positions that I talked about of power, authority, or decision making. And so there is a benefit to the types of roles like myself and many others across the sector, so long as those roles have that authority and so long as the expectation is not on that individual to do the doing, but to offer a strategic guidance direction to enable others to engage in the institution. So very practically, how do we do that? It has to be a recognition and an acceptance and a drive from the top and the leadership. So it's not about the staff networks that do and lead on all of these things without additional support or finances. There should be time allocated to staff, whether it's a whole role or whether it's people doing bits that they're interested in because they want to. So that would mean you're not doing it because you have to, but you're doing it because you want to, and you're recognized for that in your time or your salary. I think certainly working with students is really, really key within our sector, and that should be paid. So all students, ambassadors or leaders or whatever we call our student engagement is paid and recognized, and they are supported and a structure around that. And it is about that culture of EDI is actually everybody's business. I come from social work, so my term has previously always been safeguarding is everybody's business. EDI is everybody's business, and the culture Ashita talked about is that environment within the institution that recognizes that, but the spaces so that it enables everybody other than just the people who get frustrated and want to push things forward. Don't let it land on the networks. Leadership drive, recognized in role or salary, and paid student roles to work on this. And that the senior leaders all have a position that they lead on within EDI. So really quick, brief response to, I know there are many other questions, so I hope I slightly touched on that, Parveen, for you.
Thank you, Kaushika. And Kshitij, I'll come to you for that question. Yeah. A particularly impactful initiative from your perspective.
Right. So Zachary, that's a very good question. And let me address it with something that I've seen in 4 different institutions, and I'm absolutely now convinced that we've made a difference. It didn't happen overnight, it happened because of multiple efforts, and that is around promotional practices and getting more gender equity in academic promotions in universities. And I've watched this space over 25 years now. And I can absolutely put hand on heart and say, we do it much better now, whether you measure it quantitatively or qualitatively, than we did 2 decades ago. So what changed? What changed was a recognition that one thing wasn't going to do it. And the second thing that changed was the recognition that just having equality of opportunity in the university promotion ordinances wasn't going to do it. So, you know, after the, in fact, even before the race relations and other sort of gender equity acts, university ordinances around promotions were always seemingly equal, but they were not leading to equal results. So 3 or 4 things needed to happen, but they have resulted in change. So the one thing that happened was there was an observation that women of equal caliber didn't really put up their hands for promotion as commonly as men. And just telling them that they should didn't seem to make a difference. What did make a difference, if you made sure that their managers in their annual reviews alerted them to this and in some sense engaged them in that discussion. And increasingly universities have now made it a routine practice that you ask both your male as well as female, sort of reportees as to the issues of their promotion. And that sort of, but that's just raising the awareness and increasing the intention. Then the next thing one realized is that men in academia, and this is going back a decade or two, just naturally had the informal informational networks about how to make a good promotion application. So because there were more men who got promoted, it was easier to go to a pal or a mate and say, can I have a look at your application? What does it look like? What does it contain? Women tended to have less of those informal networks. Therefore, the things you had to do was to make more of that information equitably and secularly available. The next thing was who evaluates these applications. Now, almost by tradition, most of these panels used to have professors on them. Professors were already 80% men. So if you relied on that, you'd always have a sort of non-gender equal promotional panel until the day when there were equal numbers of men and women professors. But most universities actively worked, changed their requirement that it had to be a professor, broadened who could be there to ensure that there was more gender equality on representation. And the last part that was necessary was the criteria. Without knowing and understanding it so, the criteria that had been written into most promotional frameworks implicitly or explicitly valued more those activities that men had traditionally done in academic organizations. So those activities which had more to do with education, which had more to do with pastoral care, were acknowledged but were not given parity of esteem. So all of these four things have changed, from triggering the confidence in the individual, providing them the right information, making sure that the panels were more equitable in their judgments, but finally making sure that the criteria that the panels were applying were broader than they had been. Now, having done that, I have, within those 2 decades, seen a significant and dramatic shift in the number of women accessing promotion. In most universities now, the outcomes tend to be reasonably gender equal. So hopefully that gives you a sense that it isn't one thing, but change can happen. I did see it happening, and I think that would be a general formula. So it ain't simple, but it can be done.
That's a really helpful response, because it illustrates the complexity of effective interventions and the necessity of that whole institution approach. And in many ways, Gender Athena's One was one of our first whole institution approaches around EDI. David, I will come to you. I'm conscious of time, but I think we can squeeze in a response on EDI, academic freedom, and freedom of speech.
Thanks, David. If I may, just very briefly, I will underscore Kshitij's points. If you take a long view about a lot of these areas of underrepresentation and disadvantage, things have changed for the better. Not everything, but it is entirely possible to bring about positive change. It's obviously very topical, this issue of promoting inclusion and maintaining freedom of speech. I suppose what I'd say in the time available are that freedom of speech and academic freedom has to be a cornerstone of university life, not just because of the legal framework, although there is a legal framework, putting to one side whether the current bill will actually become an act of parliament, but also because it's a foundational precept of university life, to have discourse and the ability to critique and evolve thinking. However, so I think that has to be an absolute, but at the same time, it is essential that one doesn't resile from continuing to advance equality, diversity, and inclusion, and also oppose all forms of bullying and harassment. They remain, all three of those elements are essential for an effective and successful university, and probably most other organizations. How you do it is complicated, and I think that we're still learning. There are tools available. Legally, the public sector equality duty requires us to promote good relations, and I think that we can rely on that imperative as a driver for activity. I am a fan of allyship and listening programs, which are initiatives designed to enable to eliminate ad hominem approaches to issues and allow people to see the person beyond the issue, and therefore to sort of drive towards civility. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that all ideas should be treated respectfully. There is a wider legal framework, which we're all familiar with, I'm sure, but it does mean that we have to be able to engage and contextualize. I think that there are numbers of universities that are beginning to explore this now, including my own, and I hope that in the next few years we will see significant success in this area.
Thank you, David. I think it's a great example of an area where the siloed approach to EDI and not being able to consider it in that wider strategic space has potentially done us a disservice, and there is significant benefit from being able to bring EDI and academic freedom together going forwards. We are unfortunately running out of time. I would have really liked to get to Claire Taylor's question about terminology, because I noted that each of the three of our panelists raised it in their initial comments, and I think it is quite an interesting question about the effort that we put into terminology. For me, I think it speaks to the importance of continuing to have these conversations and the questions that we still do have at a sector level. One of the areas that we also didn't explore in depth was the opportunities for more collective action as a UK HE sector. And I think from some of the other discussions we've had, we'd acknowledge that that is an area that similarly has opportunities. But we are out of time. I would like to thank the three panelists that we've had, Kshitij, Kaushika, and David, for some very interesting and expert opinions. I've really enjoyed today. I will hand back to Alexis just to make any final comments and highlight our upcoming event.
Thanks, David. Really fascinating discussion. Just to sum up a bit of what we've talked about, we've talked about how to think strategically, not just operationally about EDI, how allyship forms a role in that, how to center EDI initiatives on the perspectives of those who might be the most marginalized without creating more uncompensated labor for them as well. I quite like Kshitij's idea of preventative EDI and how that can help us think about mental health issues. And I think I'd just end by drawing attention back to something that I think all of our panelists touched on, and that's how metrics can often not be enough and can even obscure how inclusive an institution is, although it is always an important starting point. This challenge of metrics and measurement is something we're seeing with the current OFS consultations as well, which may also have EDI consequences. And it leads us on very well to what our next event is going to be on May 24th, and that's on measuring the wrong things. How should we judge the success of universities in creating value? And I think EDI is going to have to form a part of that conversation as well. So do keep an eye out for that. And thank you so much for joining.
And thank you, David.